It's
okay. I started.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome to England. A long way away, but I carry memories of 3 visits to Taiwan and one most recently to your city and to the sites that you're talking about. And I found them very exciting. The first time I went to Taiwan 15, 20 years ago, I asked about what evidence was there of the war. And there wasn't much evidence, and nobody was talking about it very much. Now, of course, 20 years later, because of generational change, people are talking about it. Heritage comes alive again about the time when people are dying who knew about it. It's transferred from people talking about it to professionals talking about it, and you're the professionals. So what I'd like to do is to, first of all, relate a little bit of my view from here now. I'm stuck in a lockdown in COVID, and I have to think this is a crisis similar to a war. It is a war. In fact, I was born during the Second World War, and a number of times people have said to me, how does this relate? Well, I was only 3 during the war, but I can just remember diving into shelters to avoid bombing. I can just remember how my parents reacted and what they did. And life was managed and controlled in a way in which it's now managed and controlled in Britain with COVID. We had bombs which were called V1 bombs, which were not directional bombs. They just came over and dropped. You didn't know where they were coming from. And similarly, during COVID, of course, we have a massive rise in infection. So there's an unknown enemy just outside my window. And it's watching a government respond to this and build structures and manage things, which 50 years' time, in your lifetime but not mine, people will start saying, we must memorialize, we must make markers to remember that period in our lives. So I was coming from a point of thinking about what we're doing now with COVID and how it reflects on what we want to preserve with regard to World War II. And that's really what the first part of my paper was about. It has definitions which are better probably dealt with in your language, and I'm sure your colleagues are going to do that. But I talked about ways in which things are marked, and I talked about memory. And I think the only thing I'd like to say at the beginning here about memory is that in the design professions, we tend to take as our subject the tangible built form or very much tangible elements of the environment. But of course, these are only the products of decisions and ideas. And the memory which people have, especially the general public have, is much deeper than just of the monuments. The monument or the building does not satisfy all the needs of somebody who has memories. So the first lesson perhaps today is to really track back into the memories which people have of the buildings and environments you're talking about. Now, I know when I was there before that there were people around, for example, who'd lived in the factory, the big factory we looked at. The whole living area, it was a whole culture. There was a whole life. A generation had lived there. They held memories which they passed on to their children. Some of them are about buildings, which are markers, but some of them are about the way time was used, the way space was used, the way paths were used, the way access was used, where boundaries were. And these were boundaries established largely by the Japanese forces. Now, they may not have written them down, but that pattern, which was imposed by Japanese occupation, still lasts somewhat in people's memories. And the important thing, I think, is to not only save monuments, not only save buildings, but think about patterns, access, boundaries, and whether those can be reinforced in design. Now, that to you may sound very complicated, but I think it's fantastically liberating. I think it's something which is really exciting, because we're not just stuck with how to raise the money to save a building or how to reuse it, but we have some hints from the past as to how land may be apportioned, how routes may be created, how boundaries in design terms might be established. A whole repertoire of ideas from the past is available. And I think the challenge to you in this project is not only think of the buildings, but think of the functions during that wartime period and how people might have structured their lives in space, and because urban design is about time as well as space, within time. In COVID here in England, at the moment, we're allowed out of our house 1 hour a day, basically, to exercise. Other things are happening in time. And those time conditions may affect for the next generation how they operate. My grandchildren in school will be marked for life by the time conditions which they're being given today. And there may be boundaries, for example, which they're not passing over. There may be access ways which they're using now for the first time, which will stick with them. Now, I'm not saying that these things dictate how we design, but they're hints. They're ideas, part of that culture. So, yes, somebody said to me on this Zoom, it's quite philosophical. Well, this is, I wouldn't say philosophical, but nevertheless quite deep, because A, it's one of the things I can do at distance. I can't stand over your drawing board. I can't walk around the studio, which I'd love to do, but I can at least raise some issues, most of which are in the academic literature, about how we see space and how memory acts on space. There's an International Journal of Heritage Studies, which I'm sure is available online for you. And especially the Australians, for some reason, have been doing a great deal of work on this question of the relationship between memory and space. And you may want to dig into that at some point, just to get ideas, to reinforce ideas. At the end of my paper, and I'll say it now and I'll say it again at the end, here is this bearded old academic in England saying things which don't seem to fit in with what I do in the studio and in projects. He's only concerned about the economics, the sociology of it. No, that's not true. When it comes to designing, I can criticize, other people can criticize. The essence of design when it comes to actually doing this job is to be creative. And I find heritage not limiting. Preservation is not a limiting activity, it's a liberating activity. There are so many ideas once we start digging into the past, often in ways which we haven't done previously, which are really important to stimulate your thought. You may come up with the most modern structures in the world. Hopefully you do, because they've got to last 50 years. But they may have reference in pattern, in plan, in routes, in entrances, in elevations to the past. Only you may know them, but what you're doing is seeding into the future your perception of the past. Now, I don't think that's too difficult to understand, and I think you must agree it's a liberating activity. So that is the essence of the first part of my paper, where I talk about what's happening in COVID in Britain. It's been surprising that we've produced a design guide, which usually take 10 years to produce. Everybody knows consultations on design guides. They take a long, long time. This one has been produced in several editions within a year. And you've got copies, I think, on illustrations which are coming up, of how the detail in which changes are being proposed for Britain's high streets. Now, my point here is that there is a design guide under crisis, interesting perhaps to you, but interesting to me, because for the rest of my life, those elements, even though they're said only to be temporary, many of them will survive for 10 or 20 years, beginning to shape things. This whole idea of distancing, the whole idea in Britain of people walking down one side of the sidewalk or the other. Anybody who's been to England knows that we are not very good at behaving on sidewalks. We mix up. Will this proposal and the illustrations in the streets where there are tapes on the streets mean that suddenly a whole population is changing their fundamental behavior in towns? Now that's, you could say, just something for a crisis, or you could say that's a fundamental change in human behavior in the urban space, which is going to be with us for 10, 20 years, at least a generation. Things were happening during the war which had just that effect. And one of the challenges in this project is not only to look at the buildings, not only look at the spaces, not only to be the archaeologist and find the past in physical form, it's to find these ideas, these guidances, which may have existed then. Certainly not for design reasons, but for military reasons. But I think they may be there. So that was the essence of the first part of my paper. The second part of my paper, and I don't know how we're going to deal with this, but I would then carry on if I were standing before you today and show the images which are going to come up now, I think. And those images, I've just chosen 20 to illustrate, not directly often. Again, there are ideas behind them because, for example, none of, or so few of them don't refer to buildings, they refer to ideas, but they're just to stimulate your thought as to what may be happening around you in Taiwan at the moment. And I know sufficient much about Taiwan to know that some of these will reflect things that are there. So, for example, the use of temporary graphics in towns. I include one illustration of a seat in Germany, which says, out of bounds to Americans and Allied forces. That was a wartime, just post-war occupation symbol, which was still there 30 years later. So these pieces of information embedded in the landscape are still there to see today, as are many physical remnants. I think of the illustrations, which I'm looking at the list now just to see what I've done, many of them are self-explanatory. Just running down, with regard to COVID, it's going to be very interesting to see what survives, because most of the structures that are being erected for COVID are intended to be temporary, the large hospitals and things like this, as during the war. And many of the things were destroyed in the war anyway, but their locations are known. Then I went on, I just wanted to really highlight one or two. I get to the end of the illustrations, after the one from Germany. Just looking at those, I've got the observatory in Hiroshima. You all know that building. It's the one that survived in Hiroshima and stands there just as it was bombed. So you can see it. That is an icon. It's a large structure. It had a function. It speaks of the destruction of Hiroshima in the end of the war. The next one is a bridge in Bosnia, which I did quite a lot of work on. There's a report on it. I did it for UNESCO. And it was a bridge that was deliberately bombed in the war in Bosnia because it connected two sides. Highly symbolic. It was a connection between two communities and was deliberately bombed. And immediately after the war in Bosnia, international money was put in to put the bridge back. Symbolic. A bridge is a very symbolic feature. You can see why. I then got one or two examples of how people have dealt with, for example, one of Coventry. Coventry was so severely bombed during the Second World War that all they did was to gather the pieces of old buildings together and put them in one street. You'll see the illustration. They're old buildings in a city which is entirely modern around. I'm not sure that's a very brilliant idea these days, moving pieces to one place and making parks. I'm rather against those. I think they tend to put boundaries around heritage, and I think heritage should be in the environment. Kinmen is so interesting that it's an entirely separate world. If you've been to Kinmen, you know what I'm talking about in terms of evidence of a military society there and how that landscape is formed. But I also show, just after Kinmen, a little building in the Shetlands in Scotland. Now, the Shetlands are a group of islands right at the extent of Scotland. They're wild, they're detached, people live there. And there's this little bunker, you'll see, there's one slide, it's number 20 in my list. And it's the most basic defensive structure. It's just a concrete box. Terribly important in Shetland because they did have defenses, they had military functions, but because of the society, that is quite symbolic. In many other places, they've been torn down, they're not really recognized. So there's a valuation here in terms of the rarity of an item and how it works with the local community. And I come back to the community here. The community element is really so important.